The ground was not supposed to open up like that. Caleb had been walking the property line through the rain-soaked forest when the earth simply gave way beneath his left foot. Not a stumble, not a slip on wet leaves. The ground dropped, and he went with it, ankle twisting as his leg plunged into a depression that should not have been there. He pulled himself out, caught his breath, and looked at what had swallowed his foot. A circular opening in the earth, almost perfectly uniform, 5 feet across, too regular to be natural, and at the bottom, when he swept away the mud and the rotting leaves, his shovel hit something that did not sound like stone. It sounded like metal. Eustace Conway had been one of the most publicly documented naturalists in American history. For over 4 decades, he had lived on his 1,000-acre property in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, building with wood and stone, teaching traditional skills, wearing buckskin, and welcoming thousands of students to Turtle Island Preserve. His life had been the subject of a widely read book that called him the last American man. He had given hundreds of interviews. Journalists had followed him into the forest. His philosophy of radical simplicity and deep connection with the natural world seemed, on the surface, to leave nowhere for a secret to hide. Beneath his feet, it turned out, there was quite a lot of room. What Caleb and the caretaker team uncovered over the days that followed the storm changed the way everyone at Turtle Island understood the man who had built the place. The excavation began as a curiosity and ended as something that none of them had prepared themselves to find. Before we go into what was inside those tunnels, here is the question that shapes everything else about this story. What does it mean when a man who built his entire public identity around transparency and openness turns out to have spent decades building something in secret, deep in the earth, where no one was supposed to look? The storm that revealed what 40 years had hidden. The storms that hit the Blue Ridge region had been described by meteorologists as a once-in-a-century event. Almost a foot of rain fell in roughly 2 days. Hillsides that had never flooded in living memory ran with water. Properties across the region reported washouts, collapsed outbuildings, and sinkholes opened by the saturation of soil that had been compacted for generations. At Turtle Island Preserve, the caretaker team had been walking the perimeter checking for exactly this kind of damage when Caleb's near accident brought the circuit to a halt. Once they had cleared enough mud from the depression to confirm the metallic surface beneath, the decision to keep digging was not difficult. Whatever was down there had been put there deliberately. The shape of the opening alone ruled out anything accidental. They dug for hours in the continuing rain before the iron hatch was fully exposed. It was old, heavily corroded at the edges, its hinges packed solid with decades of accumulated clay and root growth. But the metal itself retained its structural integrity in a way that suggested it had not merely been dropped into the ground and forgotten. Someone had maintained the seal. What stopped the team for a long moment was not the hatch itself, but what they found on its surface. Carved into the iron, worn down by rust but still legible, were markings that several members of the team recognized immediately. Eustace used those symbols throughout the preserve. They appeared on his personal tools, on the carved lintels of the cabins, on saddle leather. He had developed a private symbolic vocabulary over decades, and those symbols were his signature. This was not an old structure that predated his ownership and happened to be on the property. The markings made the authorship clear. Eustace Conway had built this, covered it, and spent the subsequent years allowing the forest floor to grow over it, until it was invisible to anyone not looking directly at the spot where the ground collapsed. When they finally leveraged the hatch open with crowbars, the sound carried through the fog-wrapped trees in a way that no one present described as anything other than unsettling. A cold breath of air moved upward from the opening, carrying the dense, compressed smell of earth that had been sealed away from any circulation for years, possibly decades. Below the hatch, a wooden ladder descended into darkness. The rungs were worn smooth in the way that wood wears under repeated use. They had been maintained. Someone had been going down there with enough regularity that the ladder required upkeep. The first chamber and what the walls said. The tunnel at the base of the ladder was narrow, but not cramped. A person of average height could walk through it upright. The walls were reinforced with precisely cut and notched timber, each piece fitted together using techniques that any student at Turtle Island would have recognized instantly. It was the same method Eustace taught in his woodworking sessions, careful, considered, and built to last under stress. The construction was not rough or improvised. It had been planned. The tunnel ran in a specific direction with clear intentionality, not the exploratory wandering of someone digging without a destination in mind. The initial section functioned as a storage corridor. Shelves had been carved into the earthen walls at regular intervals, and they were full. Glass jars sealed with wax lined the surfaces in careful rows, preserved meats, dried vegetables and grains, fats and oils. This was consistent with Eustace's broader philosophy of self-sufficiency, the kind of practical preparation against hard winters or supply disruptions that would be unremarkable in the context of his lifestyle. What shifted that interpretation were the other jars. Mixed among the food stores were containers filled with dried plant material, powders of various colors, small animal bones, and compounds that the team could not readily identify. Old lanterns sat on wooden crates, their glass clouded with decades of accumulated dust. The overall impression was not of a pantry, but of something more deliberate, a curated collection assembled with purpose in mind. What do you think motivates a person to build something of this scale in secret? Not just a small shelter, but an extensive underground system concealed from everyone around them, including the students and staff living on the same property? It is worth forming your own answer before you see what the deeper sections of the tunnel contained. Locals who knew Eustace well recalled that he had a habit of disappearing for extended periods. Hours at a time, sometimes full days. He would head into the forest carrying supplies and return later covered in mud, usually in good spirits. The assumption had always been that he was seeking solitude in the way he had always sought it, alone in the natural world, away from the social obligations that came with running a property and a school. The tunnel recontextualized every one of those absences. He had not been seeking solitude. He had been building. The labyrinth beneath the mountain. Around the first corner, the scale of what Eustace had constructed became clear in a way that redefined the entire discovery. This was not a tunnel. It was a network. A second chamber opened off the main corridor, roughly 20 feet across, its ceiling supported by heavy timber beams, arranged with the same careful craftsmanship as the walls. A workbench ran along one side, covered in tools, chisels, awls, leatherworking equipment, rusted tins of nails sorted by size. This was an underground workshop, not a temporary or emergency setup, but a fully functioning workspace that mirrored the kind of practical infrastructure Eustace maintained on the surface. The corridor branching, left from the workshop, led to what was clearly the primary storage room, and the scale of it was difficult to process. Hundreds of jars and containers were arranged on shelves that extended deeper than the flashlight beams initially reached. The quantity of preserved food represented not a season's preparation, but a sustained, long-term commitment. The team estimated the stores could sustain a small group of people for months, possibly considerably longer. This was not preparation for a difficult winter. This was preparation for a complete social collapse. An abandoned handcart and a pulley system mounted to the ceiling beams provided the explanation for how so much material had been moved underground without drawing attention. The system was ingenious and entirely consistent with Eustace's problem-solving approach, entirely mechanical, requiring no external power, designed to allow a single person to haul substantial loads through a tunnel quietly and without assistance. The symbols appeared again deeper in the tunnel. Carved into the support beams at intervals, the same markings from the hatch repeated throughout the structure, but joined here by additional images, spirals, mountain outlines, and one motif that appeared more frequently than any other: an eye surrounded by extending roots. The team later consulted people familiar with Appalachian folk traditions and historical symbol systems. The consensus was that the root eye motif and several related symbols were consistent with protective marking traditions, symbols historically used to ward off perceived threats or harmful presences. Protective from what, exactly, was the question that everyone in the tunnel was now carrying. The chamber, at the heart of the labyrinth. After approximately 100 yards of additional corridor, the tunnel opened into the most significant space the team had yet encountered. A natural cavern that Eustace had incorporated into the network, its ceiling higher than anything in the constructed sections, its walls rough stone rather than timbered earth. In the center of the cavern floor lay a large flat stone slab. Around it, arranged with evident intention, were the remnants of what had clearly been a regular practice: partially melted candles, bundles of dried sage that had been burned down over multiple uses, pieces of animal bone arranged in geometric configurations. This was not a space where Eustace had occasionally meditated. The accumulation of material suggested sustained, repeated activity over many years. The walls of the cavern were covered in charcoal drawings. These were not quick sketches or exploratory marks. They were extensive, detailed, and clearly made with deliberate care. Mountains and rivers formed a landscape background. Trees with root systems that extended below ground level were depicted in detail, and throughout the composition, human figures appeared, not standing or walking, but integrated into root systems, their forms intertwined with the underground network of the trees, as though being gradually drawn downward. Whether this represented a spiritual practice, a psychological expression of something Conway was processing, or a literal belief about the nature of the ground beneath the property, was impossible to determine from the drawings alone. What was clear was that this space had been central to whatever purpose the entire tunnel system was serving for him. And then one of the team members moved a stack of rotting deer hides that had been leaning against the far wall of the cavern and found the door. The structure that Eustace did not build the door was the point at which the nature of the discovery changed entirely. Everything discovered up to this point was consistent with Eustace Conway's documented abilities and philosophy. Timber construction, hand tools, a deep practical knowledge of traditional building methods, an extensive commitment to self-sufficiency. Unusual in its secrecy and its scale, but recognizable as the work of the man who had publicly built Turtle Island for decades. The door set into the far wall of the cavern was not recognizable as his work. It was steel reinforced and set into a frame of poured concrete. There was no functional reason for a committed primitive survivalist to use industrial materials in a structure he was building by hand and keeping secret. Concrete required mixing, pouring, and curing. Steel required fabrication or procurement. Both represented a connection to the industrial infrastructure that Eustace's entire life's project had been oriented away from, and carved into the wet concrete before it had set, in lettering that was rough and urgent, rather than the careful workmanship of everything else in the tunnel, was a single sentence. The deeper you go, the more truth you find. The phrasing was consistent with Eustace's way of speaking, but the concrete was not consistent with his methods. Someone else had poured that wall. He had found it and added the inscription. When the steel door was forced open, the difference in atmosphere was immediately perceptible. The air beyond the threshold was stale in a different way than the earthen tunnels, carrying a metallic quality with a faint chemical undertone. The walls were smooth concrete, the beams rusted steel I-beams rather than notched timber. Corroded wiring ran along the baseboards. Old pipes, cracked and separated, lined one corridor. The floor was different underfoot, poured concrete rather than compacted earth. This was a bunker, not a root cellar or a survivalist shelter. A purpose-built underground facility of a kind that Eustace Conway had not constructed and could not have constructed using the methods and materials he was known to use. Here is the question that stopped everyone in the tunnel at that moment. If Eustace Conway did not build this section, who did? And how long had it been here before he arrived? The year stamped on the ammunition crate. The answer to the first question came from an object on the floor of the concrete bunker's first room. A rusted ammunition crate, military issue, with stenciled markings that had been partially obscured by corrosion but were still readable in the right light. U.S. Department of the Interior. And below that, a date, 1964. Eustace Conway was born in 1961. In 1964, he was 3 years old, living with his family in South Carolina. He would not own Turtle Island Preserve for another 2 decades. The bunker had been constructed, equipped, and presumably at some point abandoned long before he ever set foot on the property. The equipment found in the concrete section matched the 1964 date in its technology and materials. Military-grade gas masks in storage cases. Emergency rations sealed in oilcloth. Flashlights with dead batteries of a type that had not been manufactured in decades, and in a sealed cabinet on one wall, an array of radio components, coils, antenna wire, connection hardware, and what appeared to be the remnants of a receiving system. This was a listening station. The specific combination of radio equipment, ventilation design, and structural construction suggested a facility built during the period of maximum Cold War tension, when the federal government was investing substantially in remote monitoring infrastructure across the Appalachian region. The timeline that the team had been constructing about Eustace and his secret project had just been broken in half. The secret was not his alone. He had inherited it. He had discovered a facility built by the federal government, apparently abandoned and left without any public acknowledgement of its existence, and he had spent the following decades doing something specific in response to that discovery. The question was what he had found inside it that required him to respond at all. The sealed door, and what Eustace walled away. A second sealed doorway deeper in the concrete section answered that question. But unlike the steel-reinforced door that had separated Eustace's tunnels from the government bunker, this one had been sealed differently. Dozens of concrete bags had been poured one over another, building a solid wall across what had clearly once been an open passage. The work was crude compared to the professional construction surrounding it, and the tool marks in the dried concrete were recognizable to the team from the surface. They matched tools from Eustace's own workshop. He had not merely discovered the bunker, he had discovered something inside the bunker so significant that he had chosen to wall it off permanently, investing considerable time and material in making sure that whatever was beyond that wall could not come through. This reframed the entire tunnel system in an instant. Not a monument to self-sufficiency, not a survivalist's private preparation. Something constructed specifically to maintain proximity to a location that needed to be monitored. The buckskin, the primitive living, the public-facing philosophy of harmony with nature, all of it had allowed Eustace Conway to remain on this specific piece of land, close to this specific point, for decades, without anyone questioning why he would not leave. What do you think you would do if you found something in the ground that you believed needed to be contained? Would you report it, knowing it might be taken out of your hands entirely? Would you leave? Or would you stay and build your life around the act of keeping it where it was? When the team broke through the concrete wall, the air that came through the opening carried a smell that none of them found a clean way to describe afterward. Dry and metallic with an organic undertone that did not belong in rock. On the other side was a natural cavern that predated everything built around it, its walls covered in a dense biological growth that produced a faint bioluminescent glow in the darkness of the team's switched-off flashlights. Around a circular pit at the center of the cavern floor were objects that predated the government bunker by an interval that was difficult to estimate and sobering to consider. Arrowheads, broken ceramic pieces, animal pelts in varying states of decay, handmade tools in forms that suggested considerable age. Others had known this place existed long before the federal government surveyed it in 1964. Others had also, apparently, decided that it required some form of marking or acknowledgement. The letter and what it said. The wooden box was tied to a rock at the edge of the pit, sealed with wax that had been applied in a careful, deliberate manner. Inside was a single document in Eustace Conway's handwriting, and its tone was unlike anything he had produced in any public communication. The handwriting was not the confident, practiced script of someone writing for an audience. It was fast and pressured, with the quality of something written under a specific urgency, not in a moment of calm reflection, but in a moment when calm had not been available. The letter was addressed to whoever found it, and began with the words, "If you have found this, then the mountain has chosen." It described the government discovery of the cavern in 1964, what Conway believed they had encountered, and their departure. It described his own discovery of the facility years later, his decision to remain on the property rather than report what he had found, and the decades of maintenance and monitoring that had followed. The tunnel system, in his account, was not a personal project, but a practical necessity, a way of keeping regular access to the sealed area without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing so. The closing lines of the letter were the ones that the team found themselves returning to in the days and weeks afterward. He wrote that the whispers from the soil were not wisdom, as he had believed when he first encountered them. They were something else, something that operated in the register of hunger rather than knowledge. He wrote that he had tried to contain what he found. He wrote that the tunnels were alive in a sense he could not fully explain in language, and that they remembered. He asked whoever read the letter not to disturb what had been sealed. The team had already broken through the wall. Was Eustace Conway a man who had stumbled into something genuinely unknown and chosen to dedicate his life to containing it at personal cost? Or was he a man whose deep immersion in the isolation of the mountain had produced a belief system that made a natural, if unusual, geological feature into something he experienced as requiring a guardian? The letter does not resolve that question. The cavern does not resolve it either. What they establish, taken together, is that something had shaped the last 40 years of his public life, in ways that his public life was never designed to reveal. Whatever the truth of what the cavern contained, Eustace Conway built his entire existence around staying near it. He turned down opportunities to expand, to travel, to take the kind of public profile that his fame in the early years of Turtle Island could have supported. He stayed on that specific piece of ground in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He dug tunnels. He maintained ladders. He carved symbols into support beams. He sealed a door with concrete mixed by hand. The last American man was not keeping the old ways alive for the reasons he gave to journalists. He was keeping watch over something that he had decided was his responsibility to watch. Whether that makes him a guardian, or a man who built a mythology around a mistake, is a judgment call that the available evidence does not settle cleanly. What is your reading of it? The mountain keeps its own counsel on the question. But the people who were in those tunnels came out changed in a way they have found difficult to articulate, and the sealed wall is open now in a way that Eustace Conway spent his life making sure it would not be. Whatever conclusion you reach about the man, share it below. This is the kind of story that is worth thinking through together, because the questions it raises do not have easy answers, and they do not get less interesting the longer you sit with them.